Chapter 5. Blue is the colour. I liked Claudio Ranieri from the moment we met. I was excited as we drove to his house in Parsons Green, and not only because I was about to meet the Chelsea manager with a view to signing for the club. Koutner picked me up in a taxi, and there was a sense of adventure as we drove through the streets of West London. There was something about the drive that gave me a good feeling about what the future held. The area around Knightsbridge, Chelsea and Fulham Road was almost completely alien to me, but I felt an immediate attraction to it. It was a new world, exotic and challenging. I'd lived in Essex all my life and didn't know much more than travelling from home to Chadwell Heath for training and to Upton Park on match days. The air was warm and the sun bathed row upon row of white houses which gleamed in the light. Coots was busy talking tactics about how the meeting might go. I listened, but didn't feel nervous. I felt optimistic, good about the move, myself, and the direction I was going in. When we arrived, Ranieri's housekeeper answered the door. It was the first time I'd come across a housekeeper and was a little taken aback. The house was very elegant, the kind of place which I supposed was used to having staff around. We were shown into a room where the Chelsea manager was waiting for us. I found him to be very friendly and open. He greeted us politely, but with the same warm humanity he showed everyone who came into contact with him. He was well dressed, sports jacket, trousers and shirt, smart but effortlessly Italian. Classic Claudio, as I would learn over the following years. His dress sense was very much a reflection of his personality. Ranieri was of another generation to the players he coached and nurtured. He came from an era and culture which felt the need to retain a certain formality, hence the jacket. At the same time, he had a keen sense of the football environment, how the way you dress and the car you drive are an inherent part of the impression you make at a club. I think he struggled sometimes with his leaning towards old school, but then again, he had a black Ferrari he had bought in Italy and driven over, which was very nice indeed. Even beside the impressive lineup of cars at our Harlington training ground, the boss's motor drew some admiring looks. He liked that. Unfortunately, it was a little difficult to talk freely at that first meeting because his English wasn't great and almost the whole conversation had to be translated by Gary Staker. People probably first became aware of Gary as the guy who interpreted for Gianluca Vialli when he arrived at the club. He became an assistant under Luca and has been a fixture at the club ever since. Ranieri also relied on him quite heavily when he came to London. I can't imagine he'd had much time for English lessons in his first few months. Having replaced Vialli after 4 games of the 2000-2001 season, the culture of Chelsea was very much to achieve results first and figure everything else out along the way. This had led to an image of Ranieri among the fans and media which was distorted by his inability to express himself exactly as he would have wanted. I discovered the real man straight away. There was nothing vague about Ranieri. We got the pleasantries over with quickly. He laughed about the weather. I laughed. I'm not sure why, but it seemed appropriate. Then it was down to business. Not money. Football. He went to great lengths to explain his philosophy and ideas. He viewed me as someone who cared about the technical side of the game, who was keen to study and learn. He got that one right. He's an intuitive man in that sense, a good judge of character. Even though I was hearing almost everything through an interpreter, I already began to understand him. There was an instantaneous respect, mutual respect. I liked the fact that he was also very blunt. I appreciate people who are straight with me and didn't flinch when he said he wanted to improve the defensive side of my game. There was nothing wrong with the attacking part. He'd watched me play, studied me closely on video, and reckoned there was a split of 70-30 in favour of getting forward. I can't say that I disagreed too much with his assessment. I loved getting forward into goal-scoring positions, but was intrigued by his explanation of how I could be more effective. The plan was simple. He wanted to balance my play to 50-50 by coaching me to be more aware of when to make runs forward, how to time them better while picking up more on play while I was in the middle of the pitch. He wanted me for my energy and potential. Ranieri believed he could harness both and help me to become a better player. I was impressed. I'd hardly said a word, but already he'd tapped into my desire to want to improve. He outlined his vision for the team. There were to be other signings, major ones, to complement me. He planned to bring in another midfielder, and I was intrigued when he mentioned Emmanuel Petit. He'd left Arsenal for Barcelona, but had not settled as well as his ability should have allowed. Alongside Patrick Vieira, Petit had been the fulcrum of the Arsenal side, which had steamrolled their way to the League and FA Cup double in 1998. He'd also won the World Cup and European Championship with France, and now he was coming to Chelsea to play beside me. Good. No pressure then. There would be other arrivals, but my mind was already racing over 100 different things. What could we expect to achieve in the season? Would Petit be the sitting player, as he was at Highbury, and allow me to run? What squad number would I get? I had to stop myself. Ranieri was still talking, but he sensed he'd got through to me. More than anything else, though, I picked up on his overriding urge to succeed at Chelsea. He began to explain his planning for the pre-season. I was used to the traditional methods of Harry and Dad at West Ham. We were creatures of habit. We went back in the first week of July and would go running for a week over at Hainault Forest. It was simple and it worked, and I enjoyed the slog as well as the camaraderie after the summer break. We would do physical training and then start on five-a-sides. It suited the mix we had. Some good young players as well as the older characters who were comfortable doing what they'd been used to all of their career. Harry knew there was no point trying to teach old dogs new tricks, and the thought of someone like Reza Ruddock being put through a complex fitness test by Roberto Sassi, Chelsea's fitness coach, was not easy to visualise. I remember Dad had tried to make Reza run in spikes once, though I'm not sure why. He was, after all, about 33 years old and 16 stone at the time. Maybe Dad was being a bit over-enthusiastic and thought he could improve Reza's speed. Within about 5 minutes, he'd got a result, but not the one he envisaged, as Reza limped off to see the physio after pulling his calf muscle. We actually had an Italian fitness specialist at West Ham for a while. Arnoldo Longoretti. We called him Arnie. He'd worked in Serie A, and Harry's openness to new ideas led him to bring him to the club after a recommendation. It was an interesting experiment, but it was a bit too intense for some of the older lads. Ian Wright, Reza, and even Monks were getting on a bit, and Harry ended up having to tell Arnie he needed to stop. Paolo Di Canio loved him. Of course he did. He would do extra work with him, jumping over cones and burst sprinting. It opened my eyes to different methods, but it was really just a taster of what was to come for me at Chelsea. I'd acquired as much character as I had muscle development during my training at West Ham, and I was thankful for it. But I'd changed and was ready for something new. Dad had seen that in me and encouraged me to go and find what I needed to take me to the next level. As we sat in his lounge that afternoon, Ranieri already knew every detail of how he would prepare the players for the season. My mind is naturally very organised, and this appealed to me. Ranieri is similar, despite a public perception of him as someone who would bumble his way through, amusing and infuriating people in his dealings with the media. There were times when he would try to translate Italian sayings into English, or use English phrases in the wrong context in his efforts to get his thoughts across. That kind of incident happened only occasionally with the players, and he could be amusing to us as well. Ranieri, however, was very precise when it came to matters concerning the team. There was a lull in the conversation, which until then had been pretty much full on. His housekeeper brought in some drinks. Ranieri was very proud of his roots and recommended the coffee, as it was Italian. I liked his style. I felt comfortable with him and sat there for a moment while he spoke, considering my options. Aston Villa had expressed an interest in buying me, though I hadn't really given the idea of moving to Birmingham a lot of thought up to that point. Leeds United had been the first to come in for me, and I was very tempted by the aura which the club had built up around themselves in a relatively short space of time. They were very much the up-and-coming team in England, and had the reputation of being the next big thing. They were already doing well. They were beaten by Valencia in the Champions League semi-final the previous season, and were now expected to kick on and challenge Manchester United and Arsenal for the Premiership. I went up to meet David O'Leary, who was widely regarded as the best young manager in the country. I'd done my homework. After all, Rio had moved there for a record transfer fee the previous season, so it was an easy call to make. He explained that there was a great team spirit. The majority of the lads were young and shared a hunger and ambition to win things. Alan Smith, Robbie Keane, Dom Matteo and the like were good players, and the team was a tight-knit group which liked to work hard and relax together. Rio reckoned the change of scene from London had done him a world of good. It was something I'd considered, seriously. After everything I'd been through at West Ham, the idea of cutting loose from the area was very appealing. Leeds was far away from the taunts of Daddy's boy and the accusations of nepotism. I could be myself in Leeds, and also learn to stand on my own when it came to getting things done. I was desperate to put some distance between myself and my past. Leeds could be the answer. The area around the training ground at Thorpe Arch is beautiful, and there was a distinctly different feel to life there from what I'd been used to. In purely football terms, when I knew I'd be moving, I'd ask myself the hypothetical question of where I would prefer to go, and Leeds were the first club which sprung to mind. As it turned out, they were also the first team to make an offer for me, an extremely attractive one at that. In retrospect, given their reputation as the high rollers, that was hardly surprising, but at the time they had results on the pitch to match the spending. All of this created a real buzz about the club, but I was perturbed by the way it came across in my meeting with O'Leary. I was aware that Leeds were a club which knew where they wanted to be. There also seemed to be determination to stop at nothing to get there. No price was too high, whether in terms of transfer fees or otherwise. I felt it was all a bit too much. I wondered where I fitted into this grand scheme of things, and O'Leary wasted no time in telling me. He was polite enough in his manner, and said Leeds wanted to buy me, but after that I would have to fight for my place. Lee Bowyer, Olivier Dacour, David Batty, Eric Bakker and Stephen McPhail were already at the club and battling it out for the central midfield berths. I have to say I was a bit shocked, not by the fact that I wouldn't be guaranteed a start. I was happy to prove myself and expected it, but by the lack of forethought. Given that Leeds had indicated a seriousness to match West Ham's valuation of £14 million for me, I had expected them to have a plan on how best to use me, which position I would play and who with, what would be expected of me. This was pretty basic stuff, and the kind of thing I would have thought essential when weighing up spending that kind of money. Not a bit of it. Even though the whole experiment at Elland Road turned out to be as flimsy as the cheques which financed it, I thought the manager would at least have a vision of where I slotted into his plans. O'Leary, though, didn't seem to feel as strongly about it as I did. He knew about the rival offer from Chelsea and changed strategy. In his opinion, Chelsea were still throwing money at old pros whose hunger for success had long been sated or never amounted to anything more than a big salary in the first place. It was hardly a new slant on the Stamford Bridge recruitment policy of that time. Gus Poyet, Gianfranco Zola, Petit, and even Vialli were all players who'd signed in their 30s. Each had performed with differing degrees of effect. Leeds, on the other hand, were young and ambitious, and would go to the top whether I joined them or not. This was quite a risky tactic in front of me. Leeds carried themselves with an attitude that some considered arrogant, and which in some ways I quite admired. I wanted to get to the top, and wasn't ashamed to admit it. The difference between Leeds and me, though, was that I would never be as blatant as they could be. Nor, at that time, did I have their self-confidence. Overall, I was unimpressed. O'Leary said that if I wanted more money, then I should stay at West Ham. I found that offensive, a complete misjudgment on his part. Money had never been mentioned. The only reason I'd driven all the way up the M1 was to talk football with him. Contract details, salary and everything else financial were things I did not get involved with. I cared about what I was being paid the same as anyone, but the manner in which he raised the subject implied that I was just toying with the idea of moving. This annoyed me as well. By suggesting I should stay at West Ham where I was comfortable and playing every week, he was telling me something I didn't need to be told. I wasn't there to waste his time, or my own. By the end of the conversation, O'Leary had talked a lot, but I still didn't feel that I knew much more in terms of which part I was supposed to become in the Leeds machine. I'd been very hopeful about the prospect of moving to the club. More than anything else, I was desperate to better myself and become part of an ambitious team which was going places. But the experience had left me a bit disorientated. With Ranieri, I knew exactly where I stood and where he wanted me to be. That was the big difference between him and O'Leary. After that, I never really gave Leeds another thought. Ranieri made it clear I was a player who he valued greatly, as well as someone he thought could benefit from playing for him. I mulled it over, thinking about what it would be like to sign for Chelsea. I'd never supported them, though neither did I hate them. I was a West Ham fan. West Ham fans had a healthy dislike for Chelsea fans, fired by the normal city rivalry. There was a bit of history, but since it had been a while since either club had been considered the dominant force, there wasn't that much to get excited about. Apart from the geographical difference, and the fact that Chelsea had recently been seen as one of the biggest spenders in England, West Ham fans seemed quite content to target more traditional rivals like Tottenham. Nonetheless, it was still a big decision for me. I'd been brought up with West Ham, who consider themselves a big London club, and the thought of playing for another club in the city was one I hadn't previously confronted. Why should I? I'd been immersed in West Ham all of my life, and naively believed for most of that time that I'd never play anywhere else. Well, certainly not in London. My background and history was well documented, and I wondered how Chelsea fans would react to me. I was, after all, a fan of another club who would be playing for them. There was no history between West Ham and Leeds. I was leaving a club where I was getting it in the neck for being who I was. I didn't need to sign for a different one where I might risk similar treatment for the same thing. The last thing I wanted was to jump out the frying pan and into the fire as far as the fans were concerned. I just didn't know if I would be accepted. I sought the opinion of a couple of other players I was close to, Steve Lomas and John Moncur, and confided in them. My dilemma was that Chelsea were notorious for having a lot of players, most of whom were considered stars, and if I signed for them, I would obviously have a fight on my hands to get into the team. On the other hand, just being in that environment would give me the chance to better myself. Monks and Lomi were adamant. They knew I wanted to better myself and told me that I needed to put the issue of the fans to one side. I should put my football first, and at Chelsea, I had the chance to become a better player because I would have better players around me. Coming from seasoned pros whose opinion I respected, this assessment was important. Then again, maybe they just wanted me out because it meant one less midfielder. When it came, the bid which was accepted from Chelsea was relatively late, but everything moved very quickly once I'd met with Ranieri and seen the stadium. They'd paid £11.1 million for me. I tried to comprehend what that meant, but in all honesty there was so much happening that I found it difficult to gather my thoughts. I didn't even sign on the day I was supposed to. I had to go for my medical, which was routine, though I had had a hernia operation earlier that summer. Word was out, but the announcement itself was postponed until the following day, and Colin Hutchinson, who was managing director of the club, sat at the press conference and talked about how I'd been signed to replace Gus Poyet and Dennis Wise, who had just left the club. I listened to him speak, and realised this was quite a daunting prospect. Poyet was a legend at Chelsea, who had a record of scoring goals, although I arrived with a history of doing the same for West Ham. I was given Poyet's number 8 shirt, which really pleased me. It was my lucky number, and when you move to a new club, there's no guarantee you'll be that fortunate. I answered a few questions, but found the whole thing slightly startling, weird even. We walked out onto the pitch at Stamford Bridge to have photographs taken. I looked around the stadium, which I found familiar enough, having played there on several occasions. Colin gave me my new shirt, and the snappers shouted this way and that. I looked at the blue against my skin and just for a moment realised how much my life had changed. I'd set a new course for the future. West Ham were behind me, far away to the east. It was all a bit surreal, dreamlike, though at the same time it was entirely natural, even liberating. My gut feeling was good. I dreaded standing there and feeling completely out of place. Instead, I felt at home. I breathed in the air and caught a glimpse of myself in the all-blue kit. My back straightened up and I lifted my head. I felt something I hadn't experienced in quite some time. I was proud to be a footballer again. We finished with the photo call, but there was still one formality I had to complete. I had yet to meet the chairman. People saw Ken Bates as Mr. Chelsea. He was, but he left the football side of things to his managers and Colin. I didn't know him before, though from his high profile in the papers, most people probably reckoned they had a handle on him. He was infamous for his strong opinions, and for that reason I was quite apprehensive when Colin told me we'd been invited to have lunch with him at Fishnet's restaurant in Chelsea Village. Though he's rather small, Ken Bates is quite an imposing individual, very much the larger-than-life character which he plays so well. I was a bit self-conscious. It's not every day you come face-to-face with someone who's just paid 11 million quid for you, but he couldn't have been nicer, and I ended up becoming quite close to him. Bizarrely, I feel I owe him a lot because he was prepared to pay so much money for me. I wasn't responsible for the state of the transfer market. That was the going rate. But when the money being paid involves you, it's natural to feel a little anxious. I had no doubts about myself, but it was still a huge act of faith on Ken Bates's part, and a very expensive one. But something between us clicked, and he took a special interest in me right from the start. He wasn't particularly intrusive, but sometimes you'd get little snippets of feedback in the dressing room about what Ken was and wasn't happy with. If there was a problem, then he wouldn't be slow in letting you know about it. Thankfully, I managed to stay on his good side. Most of the time. It wasn't until the night before the final game of that first season, which was against Middlesbrough away, that I found myself in trouble. We were in the team hotel when he saw me walking through and invited me to sit down. Straight away I realised that it was no coincidence. He asked me if I'd gone to a nightclub in London the previous Saturday. His tone was, as ever, quiet. I admitted the charge, but I was confused and a bit apprehensive about where the conversation was headed. "You were drinking in a club," he said. "Yes, I went out and had a few drinks," I replied. "Well, I know the bouncer there, and he said you were drinking too much." I was on the back foot and not really sure what to say. "Mr. Chairman, I wasn't that drunk. I was out with a couple of mates and had a few drinks," I said, but he cut me off. "Listen, I paid £11.1 million for you, and I don't want you letting me down." That was his way, to be really straight without getting too heavy. I look back and I respect him a lot. He wanted me to know that he knew what was going on, but he also wanted me to take responsibility for my own actions. It was the same when I did an interview for a men's magazine. It was the first one I'd done, and will be the last. I'd been asked a few questions about the dressing room, the banter, and it had come out badly. There were some sexual references, and one of the tabloids seized on it and made it into something else completely. It was my own fault, but word reached me that the chairman had the hump about it. I hadn't been summoned to see him, but I was walking through Stamford Bridge one day and heard his unmistakable voice. "Frank? Come here, please." Shit, I thought. I'm cornered. I felt a bit like a guilty school kid. I knew what it was about, and before he even spoke, I let him know that I was sorry and that it wouldn't happen again. He didn't want to have a row, though. Instead, he was quite emotional. He told me that I had more class than to do interviews like that. I should think first before speaking, think about how it might be interpreted. He was right, but I wasn't sure how to respond. I had been given a telling off of sorts. I felt that he was disappointed rather than angry with me. He had taken me under his wing, and I'd been caught out, and that had hurt him. He was genuinely interested in the players, and without being disrespectful to the many foreign players who've served Chelsea magnificently, he seemed to have a particular concern for the welfare of the English boys. When Jody Morris and JT, John Terry, got into trouble outside the Wellington nightclub a year later, he defended them in public, supported them, and was the first to herald them when they were acquitted. Ken was a very loyal person and expected the same loyalty in return. He ran the club like an extended family, and his partner, Susanna, added the maternal influence. She was very interested in the wives and girlfriends of the players, and she was a real help to me when I joined. Susanna had a very gentle way about her, which was in stark contrast to Ken. Her personality is very caring, and she reminded me a lot of my mum in that sense. At the end of the first season after I signed, I started dating Ellen Rivas. Ellen is Spanish, and while her English is perfect, she can sometimes find it difficult to adjust to certain conversations, especially with people she's just met. Ken and Susanna knew we were serious about each other and invited us out for dinner at La Famiglia, an Italian restaurant near Stamford Bridge. I was nervous about going. We turned up at the Chelsea Village Hotel and were told to go up to his apartment. He was charming and showed us around before we headed out and climbed into a cab. Ken was talking to the cabbie in that arrogant kind of manner he could have, asking him if he was a Chelsea fan. The poor guy replied that he was a Tottenham supporter. Wrong answer, and Ken gave him stick until we arrived. We were seated at a good table, of course, and the waiter poured some drinks. I had a glass of red wine with my dinner, which I was quite keen to taste, but at the same time afraid to touch in case Ken disapproved. I think he noticed, and I had literally had one sip from the glass when about halfway through the dinner he simply left me out of the round when he was topping up the drinks. I thought it was hilarious. Ken is great company, a real raconteur. Unfortunately, he was chatting away about football, but speaking so quickly that Ellen was finding it difficult to follow the conversation and panicked a little bit. Susanna could see what was happening and brought the conversation back round to make Ellen comfortable. I think he did the same thing with JT. It was his way of saying that we were the English core of the team, the heart and soul of the Chelsea which he'd envisaged. Without his decision to fork out the fee for me, I might not have been at the club or achieved what I have in my career, and I'm very grateful for that. I thought it was a lot of money, though not too much, in the way others seem to believe. In fact, I was actually quite proud of the fee. I wanted it to be a lot simply because it meant that I was a valuable player to the team who paid it. I didn't feel any great pressure from it. There were probably a lot of Chelsea fans who thought it was too much at the time, and even more West Ham fans who were rubbing their hands at the thought of it, but I believed in myself more than anyone else did. Franny Jeffers went to Arsenal from Everton on the same day for just a little less, so it was all relative and down to the market at the time. The only person I really spoke to about it was Dad. He told me not to worry, that I'd be worth double in a few years' time. I laughed at him. I knew he was trying to make it easier for me, though he likes to remind me now that he was right. In any event, there was nothing I could do about the fee. It simply had to be put to one side. There was a pre-season trip to Rocca Pereina in Italy in early July, but before then I had a little bit of holiday time and moved from Essex into a flat above a shop in Walton Street in Chelsea, which the club had rented for me. It was a big deal for me, and I spent a few weeks preparing myself for it. I know I was only moving across London, so to speak, but I'd spent my whole life around where I'd grown up. It was familiar and safe. Kootner had Mark Bosnich as a client at the time, and he was already at the club and lived locally. That was a help, because he showed me around and filled me in on a few things about the club. Bozo was a real character. He took me to training on my first day, and I realised he was very much cut from the cloth with which they make goalkeepers' gloves. He projected his voice so it would boom in front of him, and when he laughed, the volume rose accordingly. This was no act. That's what he was like almost all of the time. Larger than life and always full of mischief. We would go out to dinner locally together. He lived nearby, and my flat was great simply because of its location. Walton Street is a real little pocket of shops and restaurants, and my place was just above Scalini. It didn't take me long to depend on it, and just a little longer before I had the waiters doing takeaway on just about anything from the menu. It was funny, because when I was with West Ham, eating out at Scalini was very much a big occasion. And there I was, living 2 doors away, phoning in my order, and one of the lads would knock on my door a few minutes later. It's still my favourite restaurant in London to this day. While I was settling in just fine to the area, it was a bit of a culture shock arriving at the club. Everything was very different from West Ham. For instance, at Chadwell Heath, we had our cook, Shirley, who, God bless her, was lovely, but who had a limited repertoire. Chicken and mushroom pie with pastry on top, shepherd's pie, and occasionally spaghetti bolognese. It really was a case of Sunday roast on a Monday and heavy meals all the way through the week. It was food that I loved, though not necessarily food that loved training and football. The best way to describe the West Ham canteen was that it resembled a little cafe or burger bar. There were no real facilities there. At Chelsea's old training ground at Harlington, it was not much better in terms of the environment. The facilities were crap, and upstairs we had a big open kitchen, but the food was very different. There was a choice of different pasta and salads, and I realised very quickly that my diet was going to change pretty dramatically from the first day. Apart from the culture shock of the canteen, Ranieri was also very keen on keeping track of his players' fitness levels through blood tests. I had one on my first day, and was quite shocked when they took about 10 small containers of blood for examination and testing to learn about my metabolism and general health. Strangely enough, on that first day, they found that my blood iron level was low. Not quite anemic, but bordering on it. I was very sceptical of this routine at first. At West Ham, this kind of thing didn't happen at all. If a doctor took a blood test from some of our lads at Chadwell Heath, he might have found 10 pints of lager and a couple of glasses of wine on a bad day, and I don't think we wanted to know that. Harry knew it wouldn't have worked for us, and was cute enough not to push it. Seriously, though, during that first year at Chelsea, Ranieri would give me a day off training or rest me now and again, without telling me exactly why. It turned out to be so that my body could restore the iron level in my blood. Personally, I thought he relied on this practice too much. I had no problem with the process, but I am a great believer in players knowing their own body ahead of any doctor when it comes to general health. Ranieri wanted to inject me with iron at one point, but I wasn't too keen. It wasn't explained to me why. As far as I was concerned, I was fit, and I didn't need it. In the end, I started taking iron tablets, and have continued to do so pretty frequently. But it occurred to me that I'd spent 4 years at West Ham, and not once had this problem been diagnosed. Until that point, I was very much dependent on reading my own body. If you feel good, you play, and if not, then you tell the manager and see what happens. Modern football needs much more thought, and Ranieri was used to working with sports science as a way of everyday coaching. The most we ever had at West Ham was a cholesterol test, but at Chelsea, we even had our ability to jump tested. Roberto Sassi was the fitness coach, and he measured the spring we had during pre-season. Mine was pretty poor. I'd never worked on specifics like that before, but Ranieri loved it and would sometimes leave a whole day to Sassy to work with us. We used sprint training and then running with 5 different kinds of jumps during the exercise, and at first I wondered, what the hell is this? Now, looking back and seeing how my physique has changed since I've been at Chelsea, I realise how beneficial it's been. The first 2 years were arduous, but I recognise how much my muscle structure has developed. There were some things I was asked to do that I couldn't do well or even grasp properly. I was actually quite embarrassed about it. I'd been bought at a cost of £11 million and must have looked a bit of an idiot because I just wasn't used to this kind of training. I'm not sure if Sassy had too much rein to do what he wanted, but I appreciate that it helped me. About 6 or 7 of the big players didn't return for pre-season right away because they'd been playing World Cup qualifiers and international matches. The likes of Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank, Ida Gudjonsson and Marcel Desailly had all been given a bit of extra time off. I was quite pleased, especially as I was struggling a bit to find my feet. Ranieri had a habit of taking his teams to a little village in the mountains of Italy for pre-season, and that summer I got on a plane with a group of lads I hardly knew, many of them younger players I didn't recognise. I sat next to Joe Keenan, who was another English lad and a midfielder, which made it more comfortable, and 2 seats away from me was Billy McCulloch. Billy had just joined as masseur and was a lot quieter then than he is now. I remember thinking at the time, who is this geezer? Which is a bit strange when I think about it now, since Bill reckons he's more famous than the players. He was very much in a similar position to me at the time. We were both new boys, trying to feel our way into the company without making too much fuss or making a fool of ourselves. To be fair, Billy worked his nuts off on that trip and showed just how good he is at his job. Jody Morris noticed it quite quickly, and Bill has never shied away from doing anything he can to make sure a player's in the best possible condition. I benefited a lot. JT and I wind him up about his magic hands, but we're not kidding. There's no way I could play so many games if it wasn't for Billy's expertise and commitment. We bonded on that first trip. I said to him that if he looked after me, then I'd do the same for him. And that was it. We were mates. Jody Morris and John Terry were there, and I had a natural affinity with them because they were English lads and my age. We had a 3-hour bus ride to the hotel, which actually was more like a hostel. It was quite a nice setting, but it was remote. I roomed with Jody, who I knew from going out in London with Rio, and against whom I'd played in the youth team. We had 16 days there, which was very intense and boring. The facilities were Spartan. The beds were small, and we had a little TV in the room, which had only foreign language stations. It was hard work, but it made me focus on why we were there in the first place. At West Ham, there were always other activities to entertain us, a bit of golf in the afternoon or whatever, but this was all about training. I found myself trying to stay afloat every day. It was a level up from what I'd been used to, sharper and more physical. I was struggling to impress, and some days I'd finish feeling quite down because I knew I hadn't done well. Even the simplest things seemed a little bit more difficult. After a session had finished, we would stand about 40 or 50 yards from each other, JT, Jody and me, and ping long passes to each other. Jody was a good player and had already played Champions League and was a Premiership regular. He'd come through the ranks at Chelsea, which was no mean achievement given the way the club had been importing players at the time he was maturing. I'm not sure he received the credit he deserved either. Jody's a very skillful player, a player's player. He'll never leave you struggling for an outball when you're being closed down and need a teammate to pass to. He has a great football brain and makes space for himself and others on and off the ball. When you play with Jody, you can be sure of 2 things: that he will pass and receive the ball without endangering possession, and that he'll stand firm beside you, no matter the opposition. Jody's one of a dying breed in modern football, a man's man. He's exactly the same on the pitch as he is off it, and you can be sure that he'll always tell you how it is, no bullshit. I appreciate him for that, and know he and I will always be mates. Some teams will have a premeditated plan to try and intimidate you. Chelsea have traditionally been seen by some teams as a softer touch. It hadn't happened a lot in my time, but when it did, and Jody was in beside me, I knew I could count on him. We didn't take any nonsense, and whatever people say about the physical side of the game, I would always like to have Jody beside me if a team is cutting up rough. He can play as well, though, but his contribution to Chelsea has been slightly eclipsed by the abrupt manner in which the contract he was offered to stay was withdrawn for financial reasons. John has many similar qualities, but was still a young player, though he was doing the same as Jody on the training pitch in terms of passing. I'd been a regular starter for West Ham, and they'd just paid a lot of money for me. Even so, I realised that Jody and JT could hit long balls with 2 feet better than I could. I'd just had an operation and had lost a bit of strength in my left leg. My passes were falling short, and I knew it. I was a bit embarrassed. At times, I found myself in awe of Zola or Desai, which was a failing on my part. At West Ham, I'd been used to sharing a laugh if one of us messed up, but at Chelsea, the culture was very different. I made a mistake during one early session of keep ball and looked up to find one of the experienced pros looking down his nose at me. Not quite sneering, more a look of incredulity that I'd managed to fluff something which he clearly believed everyone should be capable of pulling off. I was a little surprised. Thankfully, I benefited from one of Dad's anecdotes about Bobby Moore. Apparently, if you mishit a pass to him, he wouldn't fly off the handle at you. It wasn't his style. Instead, he'd just give you a look, a little reminder, as if to say, "Come on, that's not the standard we're playing to here." Moore was the greatest player West Ham ever had, and I realised that I'd made a significant step up coming to Chelsea. As the new lad, I had to follow tradition and sing a song at our training camp, an event scheduled for about a week in. In the days leading up, I became progressively more nervous, so much so that I don't think I cared about training because I was just shitting myself about singing the song. And it got worse. All the star players started turning up, so I knew I would have the privilege of making a fool of myself in front of all the top boys as well. I couldn't even have a glass of wine or anything for a bit of Dutch courage. I was beside myself. Some others had chosen to sing Sinatra and the like. Good for them, I thought, but there was no point in taking unnecessary risks. I decided to play safe and belted out, "Maybe it's because I'm a Londoner." It was the easy way out, but I didn't care. There were a few who had to sing, like Bolo Zenden and Petit. When it was Billy's turn, he was quite shy and said he couldn't sing a note. Instead, he volunteered to tell a few jokes. There was a strange silence. Football is a very ordered society, which is run on pretty much the same hierarchy as a school playground. It's not the place of the new boys to change the rules. Neither is it the kind of audience you want to bomb in front of. People will judge you harshly in that environment, and a bad first impression can make or break you. Either Billy was extremely confident or very stupid. He was given a chance and got a few laughs, and then a few more, until he had the whole place in stitches. That was the start of Billy the Comedian. After that, he got up every night and made us laugh. He's still doing it. JT was really quite young then, at 18, and was a bit quieter, though you could see his personality coming through, and I'd heard he was developing into a really good player. When we started training, I realised just how good he was. He'd just won the club's Player of the Year award, quite an achievement when you consider the older stars of that team. But even then, there was an aura about John, which suggested he was the future, the captain in waiting. There was something about the way he trained. You could see in his eyes the determination to get better and to succeed, and I could relate to that. Although quieter, he had a strong sense of identity which was detectable beneath the surface. The trip itself was an insight into how intense training was going to be under Ranieri and Sassi. We did 1,000-metre runs at altitude and lots of sprints. I'd just had the hernia op and felt a few twinges in my groin during shooting practice, but I didn't want to say anything. I was new and wanted to make the right impression, and I ended up doing some extra work to show how enthusiastic I was. When everyone else was finished, I would do shooting practice with Angelo, but I wasn't connecting. I could feel a bit of pain, and it was made worse by the feeling of nervousness rising in my stomach. It was like the first day at a new school, and when I think about how comfortable I am now at Chelsea, it seems like a lifetime away, but I was just so desperate to do well. We played some pre-season games, and for the one at Leyton Orient, where their fans gave me some stick, I'd been assigned a role in the centre of midfield because of the players who'd left. Also, Roberto Di Matteo was injured, and there were doubts that he would return. Zenden had come in on the left, and Jesper Gronkier had arrived part of the way through the previous season, and there was Djukanovic and Sam Dallabona and Mario Stanic. Myself and Petit were supposed to be the mainstay in the centre, and I was looking forward to playing with him. I was excited about the balance in the midfield four with two wingers and Petit as a holding player. He was naturally left-sided, and I liked to get forward. Ranieri flirted with pushing me out wide a couple of times during pre-season matches, and I began to get a bit nervous as to how well I would start the season. The concern was not unfounded. Ranieri sent me both left and right of midfield, and now I wish I'd been more assertive in expressing my feelings about that right from the start. Position wasn't the only teething problem, though, as Petit was no longer the player he'd been at Arsenal in terms of consistency, and we never really got the chance to gel in those early weeks. There were matches, though, when he was really on his game and was class. He had a lot of injury problems, though, and my partnership with him didn't quite go to plan, partly because of the tinkering. Apart from that, Manu was a difficult character to figure out. He wasn't one of the boys, and when it came to banter and hanging out, he didn't join in, making it even harder to get to know him at any level. After a while, I realised that it was just how he was. We were never going to be best mates. He was a bit moody and withdrawn, and whatever he thought of me, he kept it to himself. I accepted it, though you need a certain amount of camaraderie with the guy you're playing beside if it's really going to work. Before my debut, some of the negative stuff that I'd suffered at West Ham briefly raised itself in my mind. You never really know how you'll be received by a different set of supporters, and I'd come from a rival London club. I listened as the stadium announcer ran through the team. He got to my name, and there was a hearty cheer. Thank God for that. We played Newcastle in that first match of the season in a 1-1 draw. Zenden scored, but Clarence Acuna equalised. The result wasn't what I'd wished for, but the most disappointing thing was the fact that I got a sign of things to come. I started in the middle of the park and did all right, but ended up on the left. That happened a lot that season. I was pissed off, not because I felt it was my divine right to play in central midfield, but because I was feeling my way in and had been shunted out to the right or left for the first few games because of injuries. It wasn't anyone's fault, not really. The second outing was better when we won at Southampton, and I got man of the match in a couple of papers, but I was still getting moved around the midfield and was becoming restless about it. We were away at Tottenham the following week, and I was obsessing a bit about my performances and position. Games between Chelsea and Spurs have always had a certain edge to them, and unfortunately for me, the league match at White Hart Lane became something of a landmark event. Up until that point, I'd never known what it was like to be sent off. I found out that afternoon and did not find it a pleasant experience. I was hardly a villain. 2 bookable offences, the second of which was extremely disappointing. I fouled Simon Davies for the first, which was fair enough, but the game had then got a bit heated and was tied at 2-2 after Jimmy had scored with a penalty. I'd already set Jimmy up for the opener, but we'd been pulled back twice when I was sent through on the keeper and was brought down. It was a clear enough incident. Ledley King had caught my foot, and over I went. But the referee waved play on, and as I got up, Neil Sullivan and Chris Perry were in my face, accusing me of diving. I hate that. I'm no cheat, and anyone who knows me knows I don't go down without reason. There was a bit of a shoving match, but play was still going on until the ball ran out for a throw, and I saw the ref coming towards me. I knew what was coming. I walked off, feeling angry and frustrated. Afterwards, Ranieri came and spoke to me. "Frank, on the pitch, you have to be an iceman. Cool down." I was calm by that point. The red card didn't bother me that much because it was down to the referee's interpretation of what happened. It was the fact that they'd called me a cheat which really got to me. If I had dived, then I would have taken the stick, but I'd been fouled, and the accusations just made the whole thing worse. I was very upset. Marcel scored in the last minute of the game, and we won, which took the edge off it a bit, but I couldn't see past the fact that I was ordered off. I hate being sent off and putting the team under pressure like that. If it had been a situation where I felt I had no choice but to bring someone down, then it wouldn't have felt as bad. This was just pointless, though, and unlucky. I'd only been at the club 5 minutes and was already getting sent off. Not a good start. Ranieri knew I was upset, and he knew when to give breaks. He gave me that week off training. I was puzzled, though. It was only 2 weeks into the season, and I was fine and wanted to train, but he insisted that I should rest because my body would respond better. I scored my first goal for the club in the next match, which was a UEFA Cup game against Levski Sofia. Things appeared to be looking up, but the game after kind of summed up our season, when we were at home to Middlesbrough and were cruising at 2-0 ahead at half-time, but ended up drawing the match 2-2. I thought I'd played well that day, and Ranieri substituted me with half an hour to go at 2-1 up. They got a dodgy penalty late on, but that game showed up our fragility in that kind of contest, one where we were totally in control, but still blew it. It wasn't just domestic competition where we struggled, though no one could have predicted the controversy and furore which dogged our second-round UEFA Cup tie. The events of September 11th in New York had already affected European competitions, and when we gathered round to listen to the draw, a few of the boys were already a bit edgy about the prospect of playing a team from Israel. As seems to be the case when you wonder about things like that, we drew Hapoel Tel Aviv, and immediately most of us assumed the away game would not be played in Israel because of the obvious security risk. There was so much hostility and nervousness around the world at that time that it seemed inconceivable that we would have to go there to compete. We were convinced that we would end up playing in Cyprus or another suitable neutral venue, and couldn't believe it when we found out that we would, after all, be playing in Tel Aviv. There was a lot of unrest in the squad. The club had got wind of it and called a meeting of the players and manager in the gym at the training ground, where a security officer from Special Branch had been invited along to speak to us and answer any questions. Chelsea were desperate to send the top team out to play, and this guy did his best to reassure us that we would be well looked after. We would have an armed escort at all times, and our flight would be secured in the air and on the ground. Not everyone was convinced. There was a lot of chatting between members of the group and a few worried faces. Ranieri could be quite astute at sensing those things, and his reaction was a good one. He was under pressure from the club, but he made it clear that no one would be forced to travel and that he would not penalise any player who opted out. He was very much on our side. I think Ken Bates wanted everyone to go, but it was a difficult one to call. At one point, we discussed whether or not we should just take a collective decision not to go, but the club warned us that if that were the case, then they would send the youth team. We knew the club needed the money from a decent run in Europe, and because of the possible sanctions by UEFA, they would rather send someone to play. Even if they got beaten 10-0, it was better than a hefty fine and ban from future competitions. The manager left the room so that we could talk it over. Crisis meetings were not unusual that season. If we lost a game, then we would get together and thrash out what had gone wrong and clear the air. This was a bit different, though, and it was also a bit awkward. In those meetings, it was normally the captain, Marcel or Graham Lasso, who would lead the debate. In the end, neither of them made the trip, so it was up to the rest of us. As a group, we considered the position. A straw poll was taken of which lads were prepared to go, and it ended up that only 6 of our senior players opted out. The younger lads who were unmarried were more at ease, whereas the older guys with kids were the ones who were more concerned. Desai, Lasso, Petit, William Gallas, Chappie Ferrer, and Ida Gudjonsson. I don't blame them. I was nervous about going, and I didn't have a family of my own at that time. But anyone getting on a plane in the aftermath of the atrocities in New York will remember that it was not a comfortable or normal experience. The press made it worse, labelling the players cowards and traitors. That was really harsh, given that we were being asked to travel to one of the potential flashpoints in the post-9/11 world. Graham is a guy who would play his heart out for the team, no matter what the opposition. And Marcel will go down as one of the greatest defenders in the world, a very strong character who lived by his principles. He was also very family-orientated and strong in what he believed to be right. Oddly enough, I remember that most of the media guys were given the same option, and some didn't travel either. The press made a lot more of it than was necessary, and I don't think they really considered all of the factors involved. They just wrote what they wanted because it was fashionable to have a bit of a dig at Chelsea. I had complete sympathy with the lads who opted out, but I had worries of my own, and at one point didn't want to go either. But in the end, I felt under pressure to do so. I saw the criticism in the media and expected it would get worse. I was also very conscious that I hadn't been at Chelsea that long and was still trying to find my way at the club, while guys like Marcel and Manu were older and had done everything in their careers. I'd just signed and was supposed to have that English toughness and spirit about me, and I didn't want that questioned. People think that there must have been friction between those who went and those who didn't, but the reality is a lot simpler. The guys who got on the plane didn't want to go either. Looking back, now that I have Ellen and my daughter Luna, if the situation arose again, then I might not get on the plane. I asked Mum and Dad what they thought at the time. Mum didn't want me to go, while Dad pointed out people would question my commitment to the club if I pulled out. The £11 million price tag, again. In the end, I didn't have the courage to say no and got pushed along by the crowd. The fault really lay with UEFA because Chelsea should not have been put in that position. A couple of seasons later, Manchester United were told not to travel to Israel and played in Cyprus instead. There was a feeling that because we were not major players in the politics of football, it was easier for the authorities to make the decision they did. If it had been AC Milan or Real Madrid in our position, I wonder if the outcome would have been different. These were just a few of the thoughts I was having when we made our way to the plane to take off. It was all a bit surreal, though the flight was fine. Pretty normal, except for the fact that we had armed guards in the cabin with us, and then the coach ride to the hotel was surrounded by an army and police escort. It was the same at the team hotel, where every floor was secured by guards who would patrol the entrance and exit areas. All of this was supposed to calm us down, but it made me more on edge. I couldn't wait for the game to be played, partly because I wanted to get back home as quickly as possible. After the savaging the lads who didn't travel received, we could barely have suffered a worse result, beaten 2-0. We had the players to do better, and the only young lad who started was in central defence, Joel Kitamirike. We conceded both goals in the last minute of the game, which was a disaster. In the circumstances, a draw would have been respectable and reasonable, especially as we were missing 6 of our best players. The atmosphere was hostile, but not so much against us as in support of their own team. Ranieri had a real go at us at half-time when it was 0-0, and I thought we were doing okay, all things considered. He shouted about what the hell was the matter with us. Maybe the pressure of the whole thing had got to him, though he would quite often employ reverse psychology, so that if we thought we were playing well, he would cane us. You could be 2 up and in control, and he would question us because he wanted to make sure we would stay on the ball in the second half. Mourinho doesn't do it, but that was Ranieri's way. I was used to that. He would often lose the rag with us when we were a goal or more up and leave us a bit dumbfounded, looking at each other, everyone thinking the same thing, that we were doing all right. It was his way of keeping us on our toes. I respected his opinion on what was the best way to handle that situation, but I'm not convinced it always had the right effect. It ignored the fact that he was dealing with grown men and experienced professionals. We knew if we were playing well or not, and even though I realised he was simply employing a method to try and motivate us further, it was unconvincing. It wasn't until Mourinho arrived that I saw the other side. The first time we were winning, he came into the dressing room with a grin on his face, waited until we were all ready, and told us how fantastic we'd been. He pointed to all of the positives, and then said there was no reason why we shouldn't go on and win by 5 or 6. It was a real vote of confidence and trust. It also made us feel good and had the desired effect. For Mourinho, it's more important to treat his players like men, especially when things are going well. That's not to say he won't tell us if we're playing rubbish. Equally, he has no qualms about spelling out exactly what we're doing wrong, but again, he does it in an adult way. There's not even a hint of trying to kid us on. For whatever reason, he calls it how he sees it, and more often than not, that's the same way we see it. Even when a game is too close to call from the outside, the players will often know if they're going to go on and win. So does Mourinho. The message was a little more confused with Ranieri, and so was I. It was hard to imagine that things could get much worse in the wake of the Tel Aviv game, but they did. We hoped to banish the memory of the whole fiasco by going through to the next round, and in a show of unity and strength, 5 of the 6 who didn't travel to Israel started the home leg 2 weeks later. We went a goal down in the first half, and then pulled it back level, but we just couldn't do any more, and we lost 3-1 on aggregate. It was slightly weird. I had no experience of it, but I knew Chelsea had lost to St Gallen the year before, and it was beginning to feel like the club had acquired a reputation for this kind of thing. It shouldn't have done, given how well they'd played in getting to the quarter-final of the Champions League a couple of seasons earlier. Probably the worst fallout from the whole mess was the effect it had on those who were made the scapegoat for the defeat, people like Graham Lasso. Graham is a good pro and a good family man who did what he thought was right for him and those closest to him, and got pilloried for it. That must have had an effect on him, and to me, that was unfair. My problems were of a different kind. When I wasn't being taken off, I was still playing outside of central midfield on a regular basis, and I was beginning to get more and more annoyed. Even when I started in the middle, Ranieri would make a change, and Djukanovic would be coming on, and it was, "Lamps, go wide." What the fuck is this, was my usual reaction at those moments. It got so bad that JT and Billy would stop me on the morning of match days and say, "Where you playing this week, Giggsy?" Despite the nickname, I'm no Ryan Giggs, and while I was trying to cut in as much as I could, it just wasn't comfortable. I have a lot of admiration and respect for Ranieri, and will always say good things about him, but the tinkering and moving players around so much made a lot of us feel uncomfortable. I ended up playing 15 games on the right before Christmas, and I hated it. I tried to tell the manager, and he just said it was for the good of the team. There were injuries, and he didn't think that others could play there, whereas I had the legs to do it. I sat down with Ranieri a few times, and we talked about it. I knew I was a victim of circumstance and not some cruel joke. I was also prepared to do what I had to. It wasn't helping me to progress, though. I'd moved to Chelsea to further my development and become a better player, but I felt trapped in the wrong position and frustrated that I wasn't able to be as involved on the ball or get into positions where I would score. It was worse for me, as I'd never played anywhere outside of central midfield my whole career, only on the rare occasion for West Ham, but never for a stretch like this. I let it go for a while, because whenever I brought it up with Ranieri, he said it was his only choice. I was still new and didn't want to push my luck. I was conscious, though, that while he said he was happy, the fans and press were asking why he'd paid so much money for a central midfielder just to play me on the wing. Dad came to the games, and typically he would tell me that I had to have a word with the manager about my position. I knew what he was saying. I was in danger of being cast as an average right-winger when I wanted to excel in the middle of the park. I was worried that I wasn't performing to my potential, but I never heard any real discontent from the Chelsea fans through those first few months, unlike the West Ham fans, who would jump on you in a second. The pleasure of making my return to Upton Park was almost upon me. I knew what to expect, but, as it turned out, my granddad found out before me. He lived in Chelmsford and had a habit of going to the local butcher to get his shopping. The day before we were due to play West Ham, he was standing in line, minding his own business, when he heard the woman in front talking to her mate. One asked the other if she was going to Upton Park for the match. The reply, apparently, was as sharp as the butcher's knife. "The only reason I'm going is I want to give that Frank Lampard some stick," she said. Grandad didn't hesitate. "What did you say, love?" "That Lampard. I'm going to give him what for after the way he walked out on us," she said. "That's my grandson you're talking about," he butted in, "and before you go slagging him off, you should think for a minute what he was put through when he was at West Ham, doing his best for the likes of you." She bowed her head in embarrassment and ducked out of the shop quickly. When he told me about the incident, I was very proud of the way he'd stuck up for me and our family. Pop has since passed away, but it was typical of his desire to defend his own. At the same time as he told me, though, I felt a little sick that I'd be walking back into that same environment. They were relishing the opportunity to have a go again, and were even making it a reason for turning up. True to form, I got the anticipated reception. I was desperate to go and get a result, and had high expectations. We stayed in a hotel the night before, and as we drew up in the team bus, I was nervous and excited. I knew I was going to get caned, and it started as soon as I stepped off the coach. "Traitor," "Judas," and "fuck off, Fat Frank" were among the more polite remarks. I tried to ignore it, and just looked straight ahead as we went towards the dressing room. Whatever the problems with the fans, though, as soon as I got inside the ground, I was made to feel at home. Everyone, from the security guys to Eddie the kit man and the woman who made the tea, welcomed me. They're all genuine West Ham fans and genuine people. They saw what happened to me when I was there and told me how pleased they were that I was doing well. They still do. To them, I was a local lad whom they'd seen growing up. There was no agenda or vendetta. Even now, they apologise for the way the fans treat me when I'm there, and I appreciate it. Unfortunately, Ranieri decided I was Giggsy again, and I started the game in left midfield. I was gutted, because I wanted to do well and boss the game from the middle, but there I was on the flank. Apart from anything else, it put me right up against the chicken run, and the abuse started from the moment the whistle went. It all felt uncomfortably familiar, and it got worse. Michael Carrick scored, and so did Freddie Canute, and I got switched to the right. It was a nightmare. Jimmy got us back in it, and then a cross came in from the left, and I caught it well, but Shaka Hislop stopped it with his feet, and no matter what we did, we couldn't get back. I tried everything, and thought there was a chance I might sneak one at some point, before I was aware we were making a change, and looked with horror as my number flashed up on the board. I had to look twice to believe it, and felt the dread harden in my gut as I moved towards the touchline. I don't think Ranieri was sensitive to the situation. His decision was tactical and oblivious to the impact it would have on me. I sat on the bench and had to endure the mocking and gloating going on behind me from the fans. "What a waste of money! You're still not good enough for West Ham, Lampard," and so on. I was devastated. I got escorted from the ground by security to a car which was waiting for me. Predictably, there was a gauntlet to run, and the usual torrent of vitriol showered me as I climbed in. The next day, I rang my mum, who intentionally stayed away because she knew what the atmosphere would be like. She was very disappointed. She'd listened to the game on the radio and heard Tony Gale talking before the match. Perceptively, Gale said that I would get stick during the match that day, and that, in his opinion, I fully deserved it for the way I'd left West Ham. Mum was very angry about it. Quite rightly. She reckoned that any Hammers fans on the way to the match listening to the radio might make more of a point of giving me a hard time now that my name had been brought up again. Basically, he had wound up the situation needlessly. Gale was a West Ham player for many years and knew me and my dad, and I couldn't understand his comments. Apart from anything else, my dad and uncle had been sacked, and I'd decided to move on for reasons of family pride, as well as to better myself, so I'm not sure which circumstances he thought would justify my leaving the club. It was the right thing for me to do, and yet he felt it was all right to criticise me without taking anything else into account. He doesn't know me well as a person, and I don't remember him saying that about anyone else who had left, so I wondered why he'd had a go at me. There are certain ex-footballers who, for one reason or another, like to have a go at current players. Gale was at West Ham after my dad finished a very successful and popular spell with the club, and then left before he became assistant to Harry and I came through the ranks. He was never one to make himself known to me the way other former club pros did. A hearty hello and reference to my dad were normal when I met people who used to play for the club, but Gale was not among them. I'd gone out after the game and had a few beers, and when my mum told me all of this, I was raging. She was really sick about it, and I rang Kootner and asked him to get me Gale's number. I called him. "Is that Tony Gale?" I asked. He replied, "Who wants to know?" I thought, who answers their phone like that? Flash bastard. "It's Frank Lampard." "Nah, you're joking, ain't you?" "No, it's Frank Lampard, and I've got a problem with what you said about me on the radio yesterday." "What?" "I was quite complimentary about you." "Don't bullshit me," I said. "I know what you said, and you've upset my family. Don't you know better than that? As an ex-player, you can't say things like that to fans." I explained to him that I had moved to better myself, and because the club had sacked my dad, he had no right to go saying what he had. I asked him if he had a son, and he said yes. How would you feel if your son was put in my situation then? He clammed up and cited a family situation of his own as a reason for saying what he did. For the following 15 minutes, I had a go at him again, but he displayed a very arrogant attitude and kept insisting that he hadn't done anything wrong. "Those same fans who you were inviting to cane me have been having a go since I was 17, I said. "You went to West Ham then, and you know that." "Rubbish," he said. This made me angrier. I didn't understand why he'd been so aggressive, not at that moment, but on the radio. I imagine he thought I was just a young kid who had no right to phone him up and dig him out. What really pissed me off was the fact that he didn't know me or my situation. Gale is one of those ex-players who hears whispers about this and that coming out of his old club. For that reason alone, he must have known there were things going on with Dad and Harry. Despite that, I felt in this instance that he never offered any kind of balance to his comments. Had he taken the time to call me or Dad and ask the circumstances, then we would have been happy to let him know. Instead, he chose to make his own interpretation, and that's what annoyed me so much. It doesn't take a genius to work out that things are not going well when my dad and uncle are sacked. He had no excuse. One of his peers, Alvin Martin, has a similar position in the media and makes the effort to find out first what has actually happened before voicing his opinion, and I respect him for that. It's obvious that he realises that some balance is needed in what can be delicate situations. With Gale, the whole situation has just rumbled on and on. It still does. He had a decent career, so I didn't understand his apparent need to slag me off. I'd pushed myself to the verge of a starting spot before Euro 2004, and sure enough, before the tournament started, Gale was writing that I was a million miles away from being picked, and others should be. There have been many other examples of this. When reports broke in the summer of 2005 that Real Madrid had offered Michael Owen to Chelsea, plus £20 million, I knew what was really going on because Kuttner had taken a call from Spain explaining the situation. It came from a conduit in the deal who was acting for Real, and they wanted to know if I would consider moving to Madrid. It was the same time as Steven Gerrard was mulling over his future, and, like clockwork, Gale waded in with his weighty opinion. Steven Gerrard is the world's best midfielder, and that is why Real Madrid are so keen to make him a Galactico. The Spanish giants, backed by a staggering £110 million transfer kitty, have also been linked with a cheeky move for Chelsea's Frank Lampard. I'm sure Real would rather have Gerrard at the Bernabeu next season. Kuttner called him and asked him reasonably why he always wanted to put me down. Stevie is the calibre of player who would interest any club in the world, but that wasn't the point. My problem was with Gale. Even when the subject didn't concern me, he still found a way of dragging me into it. He denies it, but it's simple enough to trace to my original call of that Sunday morning. I can't understand why it's lasted this long. He could have called me and buried the hatchet. We were both West Ham lads, and I don't want any bad blood, but such instances make that very difficult. It doesn't stop with me either. There was an incident when Harry was considering returning to Portsmouth from Southampton, and Gale tore him to shreds on the radio. Jamie was listening, and immediately called Gale's mobile and let him know what he thought in a long and very angry message. Funnily enough, he's still waiting for a call back. It's got to the stage now where it's become a standing joke between me and my family and mates. I don't care what he's made of his career. I just wish he wouldn't feel the need to have a go at other players in the papers or on TV. I rang Dad to tell him that I'd spoken to Gale, and he was pleased I'd stood up for myself, though reckoned I would have put his back up even more. Dad has a habit of trying to calm me down by saying that even Bobby Moore got stick at West Ham, and he was the best defender there ever was. He was very much taken under Bobby Moore's wing at West Ham as a player and a person, and he often says he sees a lot of him in me, the way I move and play, the fact that I never react to a tackle or get the needle, which is very flattering. I wasn't the only one dodging bullets at that point, though. As a team, we were beginning to get a bit of stick in the media for being inconsistent, and, unfortunately, the ensuing run of games showed it was justified. Chelsea have a habit of playing well at Old Trafford, and when we went there at the start of December, we thrashed them 3-0 and played them off the park. It was the kind of display which we were easily capable of, but it followed 2 depressing draws against Everton and Blackburn, which once again exposed our fatal weakness with regard to pushing on and doing great things, which required consistency. I reflected on the first few months of my time there. There's no doubt that I made the move with the intention of challenging for the league, but once we started the season, I quickly realised that we were not on championship form, and in retrospect, we just didn't have the capability. The consistency was missing, and we didn't have the all-round quality in the squad. A few of us had just signed, including William Gallas and myself, and you could tell a natural pattern of play was failing to evolve. But the team was changing every week, and you can't win the title when the team is different from match to match. We would play against teams which were mid-table or lower down and get beaten or draw. It didn't need much analysis to conclude that we weren't going to be at the very top come the end of the season. It was even worse when it happened at home. We lost 4-2 to Southampton and were outplayed during the Christmas period, and results like that just don't add up to a title. What made it worse was that we had good players, but there were just too many games when we were poor. I felt that I was the epitome of that. I was still finding my feet and didn't always play the way I wanted. When there's no consistency in selection, then it will tell in the performance, and the fact that we finished 6th in the league but made the FA Cup final just about sums it up. I had once again played on the wing at Old Trafford, but things looked up and I moved into the middle and we beat Liverpool 4-0. The transformation was immediate. I scored my first league goal against Bolton, and I can honestly say that it wasn't until that moment that I felt completely comfortable in a Chelsea shirt. It had nothing to do with the fans. After what I'd been through at West Ham, I was relieved and pleased at the way I'd been received. I know what London is like. Some of them must have been worried. People go for a drink with their mates who are Hammers fans, who would have been saying, 11 million? Thanks very much. We didn't want him anyway. I had a lot of feedback at the time that people were saying that kind of thing, and it would have been understandable if some supporters started to wonder about me, given they saw me playing out of position. Especially when they've got people in their ear telling them I'm not worth the money. On the 20th of January, I got my chance to silence them. After the crap I'd taken at Upton Park, West Ham arrived at the bridge and we gave them a hell of a tanking, 5-1 to be precise, and it felt beautiful. Ida and Jimmy got a couple each and we murdered them. The away fans had started the game giving me the usual abuse, but shut up after about 10 minutes. I remember we were 3 up after an hour and they didn't score until very late, and I just spent the last 20 minutes shooting from every angle I could to try and get a goal against them. JT came up to me and was laughing. "Desperate for a goal, Lampsey?" he grinned. "Come on, try a bit harder, will ya?" He was taking the piss and so was I. He knew how much it meant to me. He saw it in my eyes and had heard enough about it in the changing room at training the week leading up to the game. Every time I got near the away section, I smiled a broad smile, just to let them know as well. Thankfully, Chelsea fans are more generous with their patience. They were good with me, and as soon as I moved into the middle, they were on side. I wondered where and how we would finish in the league. I thought that we could still make Champions League qualification, but as the season progressed, that dream slipped away as well. Maybe I wasn't being ambitious enough, but I was pretty content to be playing every week, knowing that we had the potential to make the top 3. I had finished in 5th place once with West Ham, but that was unusual rather than expected. I looked around me, though, and felt that I was at a club which was going places. Franco Zola was an incredible player for Chelsea, but he didn't get as much playing time that season because Jimmy and Ida were amazing. They scored 51 goals between them, and it was probably the best strike partnership I've ever played with. I wonder if I'll ever see a better one in the Premier League. Everything about them was ruthless and magical at the same time. Touch, passing, link-up and shooting. There were times in that year when 9 of us were playing okay, and those 2 won the game for us. I wasn't gutted that we didn't win the league, and it was partly because I had guys like that around me who I knew were capable of lifting the club to claim silverware. I felt my own game was improving, and I'd stepped up in my career. There were, of course, moments when I was reminded that we still had a long way to go. The League Cup semi-final second leg against Spurs was one of those. We were 2-1 up from the home game, and on the verge of reaching my first final, and we got pumped 5-1. It was horrible, especially as it was the first time in about 10 years that they'd beaten Chelsea. You learn from those defeats, though, and I learned quickly because we drew them in the FA Cup a few weeks later, which by that time was a real pressure game for us. We were well out of the top spots, and this was the last chance of winning something. We'd begun the campaign a bit shaky with a draw away at Norwich, but then cruised through the replay at home. I was delighted to play West Ham in the 4th round, though again we drew the first game at home and had to go to Upton Park to decide the tie. Jermaine Defoe scored a couple for them, and twice we had to pull it back before JT popped up in the last minute to clinch it. Nice one. He was emerging as a very important player for us. I went mad because I'd taken the usual stick through the game and would have been distraught if we'd gone out to them. The FA Cup run saved our season. Even though we lost the final to Arsenal, if it had gone the other way, then people would have said it was a really good year for Chelsea. We qualified for the UEFA Cup in 6th place and reached the League Cup semi-final. It's nowhere near the ambitions we have now, but at the time it wasn't too bad. Personally, I was pleased with the way it had gone, and my performances had got better and better after Christmas, and I had scored a few goals. I enjoyed the quarter-final at Spurs because we won 4-0 and got our revenge for the game a few weeks before. We had to play Fulham in the semi-final at Villa Park, and once again it was JT who was on target to get us to the final in Cardiff. I was buzzing the morning of the game. I'd slept a bit, but not much. I was desperate to play. The FA Cup final was always something we'd all got round the telly to watch every year when I was growing up, no matter who was playing. My dad had played in 2, and this was my turn. Our preparation had been good, all except for Jimmy. He'd been struggling with a calf injury and only flew in from Leeds the night before the game, having seen a specialist. I was surprised when I found out he would start, but both he and JT had undergone fitness tests a few hours before kick-off. JT had woken up feeling dizzy and had lost his balance and fallen out of bed. He went immediately to see the doctor, and the doc went to see Ranieri. John had recovered by the time we had the team meeting, but the manager had already decided to play Gallas in the middle in his place. John was distraught. Like me, this was a competition he'd grown up with, and we both would have walked over broken glass to make the team. He was ready to play and had passed the test the same as Jimmy, but the gaffer decided that only one would play. I didn't think that much of Jimmy's selection, because when a player is past fit, you expect him to be just that, but the warm-up in the changing room raised doubts. We stood in a circle to do some stretches and some running on the spot for 5 or 10 minutes. Jimmy was there doing it, but he had a TENS machine strapped to his calf to try and improve it and ease the pain. I had every faith in Jimmy, but if he was doing that an hour before the biggest game of our season, there had to be a question mark about whether he was able to play. Jimmy at 70 or 80% is better than a lot of other players, but the options were limited for the manager. Jimmy is very ambitious and was desperate to play, but unfortunately, after 10 minutes of the game it was obvious he wasn't up to it. He tried and failed very early, and Ranieri should have changed it earlier than he did. We had a decent first half. There was no score, and we were holding our own and doing okay. We had a lot of possession, but no cutting edge, and I was pleased with how I was battling with Patrick Vieira. In the end, it took the manager 68 minutes to bring Franco on for Jimmy, and by 70, we were a goal down. Ray Parlour scored before Freddie Ljungberg killed it 10 minutes later. There was a perception that Jimmy was a favourite with Ranieri, but I don't think that was true. Jimmy is one of the best strikers I've ever played with, and one of the best I've ever seen. When he played, it was usually because he deserved to. People forget that even in Roman Abramovich's first season at the club, when Jimmy would often be the one who was subbed for Hernan Crespo or Adrian Mutu, he still finished as top scorer. Maybe Ranieri's decision in Cardiff was out of respect for what Jimmy had given to Chelsea. He deserved the chance to show if he was fit or not, and Ranieri's error was perhaps that he didn't see how badly he was struggling earlier in the contest. On that occasion, the man famed for his tinkering didn't tinker enough. The season wasn't quite over yet, or so I hoped. The squad for the World Cup finals was due to be announced the following week. We'd played a few friendlies in the build-up, and I managed to hold 5 minutes against Paraguay at Anfield in March. There was the usual speculation in the papers about who would go to Japan and who wouldn't, and I seemed to flip between the departure lounge and sitting at home watching on the telly. The vibe I was getting from Eriksson was always pretty good, and I looked around at some of those who were in competition with me. I felt I was in a favourable position. I'd played well against Vieira in the FA Cup final and was optimistic, having finished the season well. The news broke that Eriksson was going to call those who were being left at home, and I remember getting up late that particular morning without thinking about the fact that the squad was about to be announced. My mobile rang. It was a withheld number. Despite being quite pessimistic by nature, I still thought I would go. I heard his voice say, "Hello, Frank. It's Sven Eriksson." I didn't have time to think, and before he reached the end of his first sentence, my heart had sunk. "It was a difficult decision, Frank, I assure you," he said, hoping to soothe the pain. "You are a young player, and there will be more opportunities for you to play in the World Cup." I was still trying to take all of this in. I was in shock. Even though I had never convinced myself I would be going to Japan, I had hoped deep within me, that I would be on that plane. "Look," said Eriksson, "go and enjoy a holiday this summer and come back well next season. I will be coming to watch you for Chelsea and will be looking to pick you for the Euro 2004 qualifiers." "Yes, thanks. I will." I could barely squeeze the words out. My mouth was dry and the phone fell to the floor. I was dumbfounded. I walked around the flat. I wasn't going anywhere. Not Japan. Not anywhere. I finally sat down and wondered what I should do. I was too embarrassed to call anyone and talk about it. I wondered if life could get much worse than this. It did, and quickly. Instinctively, I switched on the TV, and the squad announcement was making the headlines on Sky. It turned out there was a reserve list as well as the actual selection. There I was, half thinking I would be on the plane, and it turned out I wasn't even on the waiting list. Not even on the fucking wait list. I thought about what Eriksson had said to me, went over the conversation again and again in my mind. It was a horrible call to make, but he did it the best way possible. When the shock subsided, I got very angry. Not with Eriksson, but with myself. What could I have done better to have forced my way in? Where could I have played better? Could I have scored more goals? Did I train hard enough? The third degree became a fourth, and then a fifth, and so on. I couldn't help but scrutinise every little moment of the season. It didn't help or solve anything. So, I got angry with the situation, convinced myself that there was nothing I could do now, and that I had to go through the feelings and then get on with it. When the emotions subsided, I decided the best thing for me was to get out of the country. I watched the World Cup on TV, but I didn't enjoy it. My head was still buzzing with what might have been. The only thing on my mind was getting back into the England team.